Thank you so much, Theo, for joining us on this podcast at DawdleLive. Extremely grateful that you took out time to share your insights with our global audience. We've got pretty interesting set of topics to discuss with you and kind of profile that you have. It's going to be a tough challenge, to kind of host you for the coming 40 minutes, but still I will give my best. So for all the audience which is there, we'll try to introduce Theo in the best possible way. Highly accomplished global technology and transformation leader with over 25 years of experience advising enterprises and investors on AI, digital transformation, and large scale modernization. He's currently operating as a fractional CTO and advisor where he partners with software companies and VC or PE firms to shape AI strategy, conduct technology due diligence, and drive value creation across complex enterprise environment. He has held prior leadership roles at Accenture, Cognizant Frog, where he has built and scaled global innovation and technology practices, led multi-billion-dollar transformations, and advised Fortune 1000 executives on cloud, AI, and operating model redesign. Thank you so much, Theo, for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here with you today, Rishi.
Oh, you pronounced my name well. I'm happy. Great, Theo. Theo, the first one is that, you have moved from building and scaling large transformation businesses to now advising enterprises and investors as fractional CTO. What becomes clearer when you step outside of execution and start evaluating companies from a distance?
Great question, Rishi. And I'd say there's something that happens when you step out of the day-to-day execution pressures, if you will. You start to see the system instead of just symptoms. When I was inside large organizations, scaling Cognizant's digital business from a single employee to over $3 billion global organization, or leading board-approved cloud transformations at Accenture, you're operating in a mode where speed and momentum can actually obscure the underlying structure. You're solving the problem in front of you. The advisor's seat actually changes that. The first thing that becomes clearer is what I would think of as pattern recognition. When you're moving and working across multiple companies simultaneously, advising enterprises, doing tech due diligence, you start to see the same failure modes repeat. A life science company struggling to operationalize AI looks remarkably similar to a retail healthcare company struggling to modernize its platform. Yeah, the technology stacks are different, the industries are different, but the root cause is often the same. These companies invested in the capability without redesigning the operating model around it. I've lived that myself. One of the most meaningful engagements I've been on in the last few years was seeing the establishment of a data and AI office for a rare disease unit in a leading pharmaceutical company that was ultimately able to compress its diagnosis time from 5 to 10 to 15 years, sometimes for a rare disease, down to 1 to 2 years. The machine learning model was remarkable, but the real unlock was the operating model. In my mind, that's pattern recognition in action. The second thing you see more clearly is systematic failures. When you're inside, there's always a narrative, a plausible explanation for why things aren't working that tends to center on external factors or resource constraints. From the outside, you can see the dysfunction is usually structural. It's in the governance model, the incentive structures, the way IT and business have been siloed. Large transformation programs, in my experience, fail not because the technology doesn't work, but because no one built the accountability structures to sustain them. I saw that repeatedly. And the final thing I'd say is probably the most sensitive is leadership blind spots. Senior technology leaders are often extraordinarily capable, but when you're inside a system, your assumptions become invisible to you. That's actually what I find most valuable about the fractional CTO and advisory work I'm doing now. The outside perspective isn't a criticism, it's a gift. I can ask the question that no one inside the organization is willing to ask, or that gets filtered before it reaches the CIO. The executives I've worked with over the years, the best ones, they want that challenge. And that's how real transformation gets unlocked.
This was pretty well explained, actually, Theo. Like, you've structured it pretty well, like these 3 pointers. Theo, you kind of work very closely with VC and PE firms, and you kind of access the AI-driven companies, assess them, right? And so when you evaluate an AI business, what are the first few things that you look at to determine whether it's a real value or just a well packaged hype?
Well, Rishi, this is probably the question I get asked most by investors right now, because the market is flooded with companies that have learned to speak the AI language fluently without necessarily having the substance underneath it. The pitch decks all look similar to me. The demos are always impressive. So the real work is learning to look past the narrative and into the architecture, both technical and organizational. The first thing I look at is what I'd call the data reality check. Every AI company tells you they have a data advantage. Very few actually do. I want to understand, where does the data come from? Who owns it? How is it maintained? And critically, does the model actually need proprietary data to work? Or is it a wrapper around a foundation model that any competitor could replicate in 90 days? Data moats are real, but they are rare. When I find one, it's usually because the company has been quietly accumulating structured, labeled, domain-specific data over years, often before they even knew they were building an AI business. That's signal. For example, I'm currently advising a client who provides management software for operating rooms in hospitals. They've been collecting data on millions of operating rooms performance for years. And that data is now the foundation of a very powerful AI model that no one is going to be able to easily replicate. Now, the second thing I look at is model viability and architectural honesty. I want to sit down with the technical team, not just the CTO in a polished briefing, but the people actually building the system, and understand what their model is actually doing. Is the AI core to the value proposition, or is it feature level? Is the output accurate enough to be trusted in a real operational context, or does it require so much human review that the efficiency claims start to fall apart? I've been with companies where the AI is genuinely doing something novel and defensible. I've seen many more, however, where it's sophisticated automation dressed up in AI language. There's nothing wrong with automation, but investors need to know what they're buying. The other thing is where I think technical advisors add the most differentiated value. Is scalability the operating context? A model that performs beautifully in a controlled environment or on a curated data set can fall apart the moment it hits the viability of real enterprise data. So I'm asking, has this been deployed at scale in a regulated environment with real users making real decisions on the output? In life sciences, in healthcare, in financial services, the gap between it works in the lab and it works in production is enormous. The companies that have bridged that gap have usually earned it the hard way. And then finally, governance and explainability, especially in regulated industries. I want to understand whether a company has bought or thought seriously about model drift, auditability, and how decisions get explained to regulators or end users. Nobody wants to buy a black box, because the companies that haven't built governance into the architecture early are going to face a very expensive retrofit later. And that's a risk that doesn't always show up in the capitalization table. But I'm ultimately trying to answer the simple question. If I strip away the deck, the demo, and the narrative, is there a durable business here? The signal is usually in the data details that the companies don't volunteer. The noise is almost always in the things they lead with.
That's superb. But despite of all these massive investments, Theo, we see that many enterprises struggle to scale AI beyond pilots. And you have already touched upon this, like the digital transformation piece, basically. So from your experience, what are the structural reasons behind it? And what does it actually take to move from experimentation to enterprise-wide impact? And I will just like to add one pointer is that I was talking to a leader, I think, 3-4 days back, and he told that there is 92% AI adoption. Sorry, there is 92% AI experimentation, like pilots. Only 1% has been adopted within the organization.
Yeah. This is a question that has defined most of my career, honestly. I've watched organizations spend hundreds of millions of dollars on AI and data programs and then struggle to point to the business outcome that justified the investment. And I've also seen the other side, where a well-designed operating model unlock something genuinely transformative. The difference almost never comes down to the technology. The first structural reason things stall is what I call the pilot trap. Enterprises are actually good at running pilots. They find a motivated team, a clean use case, a contained data set, and they produce something impressive. The demo goes well, leadership gets energized, and then the pilot sits there. What organizations systemically underestimate is that scaling from a pilot to an enterprise capability isn't a technical problem. It's an organizational one. It requires redefining workflows, retraining people, renegotiating the relationship between IT and the business, and building the governance to sustain it. None of that is in the pilot budget, and none of it is glamorous work. So often it doesn't get done. I'd say the other structural reason is incentive misalignment. AI transformation asks people to change how they work, often in ways that feel threatening to their expertise or their role. If the incentive structures inside the organization don't reward that change, if the business unit leaders are still measuring on the same KPIs they were using before, then you're asking people to take on a personal risk in service of an enterprise goal that doesn't show up in their performance review. I've seen this kill more transformation programs than any technical failure ever has. The leaders who crack this understand that you have to redesign the incentive architecture alongside the technology architecture. Finally, I'd have to say, is the absence of a clear theory of value. Most organizations launch AI initiatives without having first answered the question, what does success actually look like? And how will we know when we've achieved it? They invest in the capability without defining those KPIs that will validate it or show real business tangible value. I spent a significant part of my time at Accenture building value management governance frameworks precisely because of this. On one cloud and data transformation I did for a top pharmaceutical company, that discipline delivered $29 million in verified value in year one and over $61 million in year two. The technology didn't change between year one and year two. What changed was the rigor around measurement and accountability. But if I had to point to the single deepest structural issue, Rishi, it's this. Enterprises treat AI as a technology deployment when it's actually an operating model redesign.
Yes.
The organizational that move from experimentation to enterprise-wide impact are the ones that ask a fundamentally different question. They don't ask, where can we apply AI? They ask, if AI were core to how we operate, what would we do differently? That reframe changes everything. The rare disease example, compressing diagnosis from 10 to 15 years down to 1 to 2 years, didn't happen because someone deployed a great machine learning model. It happened because they built a data and AI office, established shared services across data governance and quality, and of course, privacy, and finally redesigned how the organization made decisions around data. The model was the output. However, the operating model was the actual intervention.
It's kind of similar, Theo, to the point when this cloud and all came up. Like, I think a lot of the organizations, didn't implement it well. They had, cost overruns. And, because as you rightly told, like, you just mentioned that, your operations have to be shaped in a way like, if AI is at the core, how will you run your organization?
That's
Not
right.
like, and Theo, you have kind of worked on value creation, planning, and governance at a scale. And so, how do you kind of differentiate between a real transformation that drives measurable outcomes versus what you might call a transformation theater?
I love that expression. Transformation theater is more common than most people in the industry really want to admit, Rishi, and the uncomfortable truth that it's not always accidental. Sometimes organizations, and I'd include some consulting firms in this, have structural incentives to produce the appearance of transformation rather than the substance of it. Big programs, impressive roadmaps, compelling names and narratives for the board. And then you look for the business outcome and it's just not there. The way I differentiate real transformation from theater, as you call it, comes down to three things. And the first is the most revealing. Who actually owns the outcome? In transformation theater, as you say, the program has a sponsor, but the outcome is orphaned. The consulting team owns the delivery, the technology owns the implementation, but nobody in the business has personally committed to a number that they will be held accountable to after the program ends.
Yes.
Real transformation looks very different. The business unit leader has real skin in the game. The CFO has signed off on the benefit assumptions. The board is actually tracking realized value on a regular pace, not just milestone completion. When I led the value management governance on the pharmaceutical transformation I mentioned earlier, migrating more than 35 global data centers, redesigning operating models across a workforce of thousands, one of the things we established was a benefit realization framework that the business owned, not the technology team. That single structural decision changed the accountability dynamic for everything that followed. I'd say the other differentiator is what gets measured and when it gets measured. In
Yeah.
theater, as you call it, organizations measure inputs and activities. How many people were trained? How many sprints were completed? How many use cases were identified? How many tokens did we use? Real transformation measures outcomes continuously, not just at the end of the program. Think about the KPIs that connect directly to a P&L impact,
Yes.
cost avoidance, defect reduction, productivity uplift, actual revenue contribution. On the programs where we got this right, we had a live view of benefit realization that the CIO could walk into a board meeting with and defend. Finally, the other differentiator I want to highlight is whether the technology investment is anchored to a business problem that the business actually cares about. I've seen organizations spend years modernizing their data architecture, migrating to the cloud, building an AI capability. And when you ask the business what's changed for them, they look at you blankly. Yes, the technology got more sophisticated. The business got no more competitive. That's the expensive part of what you call transformation theater. The question that I always ask, and it's actually a simple one, but it cuts through a lot of noise, is can you show me the line from this technology investment to a business result that your CFO would recognize? If that answer requires more than two steps to explain, that's a signal worth paying attention to. The governance question is not a compliance question, Rishi. It's a value question. Organizations that build rigorous governance around their AI programs are the ones that will be able to demonstrate ROI to their boards and continue investing through the inevitable periods of friction. The ones that don't will find themselves explaining 2 or 3 years from now why a very large AI investment didn't move the needle. That conversation is happening now in a lot of boardrooms that I walk into.
Yes. And that is one of the reasons why these all 90% transformation projects fail, basically, because you're absolutely right. And I can see a lot of clients, Theo, even if you talk about the consulting, companies, strategy consulting companies, a lot of clients are kind of forcing upon the commercials being like, 50% on the strategy that they're making and 50% on the execution. But as you rightly told, is that unless or until the business takes up the responsibility of those KPIs,
That's right.
it's not going to happen. Yeah.
Exactly, Rishi. And linking those KPIs to business value and real tangible business outcomes.
Yes. Yes. I've seen that, kind of in a couple of cases. So I kind of was thinking about that. Like, Theo, across your experience, right from Cognizant scaling to Accenture advisory, you have seen operating models evolve dramatically. What are the hardest decisions leaders need to make when they are redesigning how technology and business actually work together?
Great question, Rishi, again. I'd say operating model redesign is where transformation gets real. And it's where leadership courage gets tested because everything else, the AI strategy, the governance framework, the value measurement, all of it eventually runs into the human and organizational questions. And those are the ones that don't have clean answers in a slide. When I was part of the team building Cognizant Digital Business, taking it from that single employee to a $3 billion global organization in under 3 years, we were making operating model decisions in real time, under pressure, without a playbook. And then for almost a decade at Accenture, I had the opportunity to sit across from CIOs, CTOs, CDIOs who were trying to make those same decisions inside of organizations with decades of structural inertia. The problems rhyme, but the difficulty is categorically different when you're trying to redesign something that's already running at scale. The hardest decision, and I've seen this derail more than one transformation, the hardest decision, almost more than anything else, is what to stop funding. It's always easy to start funding new projects, but what are you going to stop doing? Organizations are generally quite good at adding new capabilities. They are extraordinarily bad at retiring old ones. When you design an operating model around AI and product-centric delivery, you're implicitly saying that some of the old delivery structures, some of the old governance bodies, some of the old roles, they no longer serve the organization the same way. But nobody wants to be the leader who defunds the legacy. So what happens is the new model gets layered on top of the old one, which means you're now running two operating models simultaneously with all the costs and confusion that creates. The leaders who actually transform their organizations are the ones willing to make what I would think of as a subtraction decision, not just the addition decision. The next hardest decision is how you fund the work. Most large enterprises still fund technology through an annual project-based budget cycle. That model made sense in a waterfall world. It is fundamentally incompatible with how AI and product delivery actually work. Continuous, iterative, and impossible to fully specify upfront. Shifting to a product funding model where you fund stable teams and capabilities rather than discrete projects changes the relationship with your finance organization, changes how the business case gets built, and changes how you account for technology investment on the books. I watched this play out on the pharmacy platform transformation. It was in 9,000 locations, and the funding model conversation was as complex as any technical decision we made. The organization that navigate it successfully do so because a senior finance leader is genuinely partnered on the redesign, not just asked to approve a budget at the end. The hardest decision, I'd have to say, is who has accountability when the model doesn't produce the outcomes you projected. Traditional IT operating models have clear lines for delivery. Did the project ship on time? Was it on budget? Was it to spec? Product and AI operating models shift that accountability to business outcomes. Did that capability actually change the business? That's a harder question, and the accountability is shared across technology and business in ways that make it genuinely uncomfortable to assign. I've seen leadership teams spend months designing elegant new operating models and then fold back to old accountability structures the moment something goes wrong, because the old structures at least tell you who to blame. And underneath all of these decisions is a common thread. Operating model redesign is fundamentally a political act, Rishi, not a technical one. When you do it right, it redistributes power. It changes who controls budget, who has decision rights, who sits at the table when the strategy gets made. The organizations I've seen navigate this successfully have two things in common: a CEO or a board that has explicitly endorsed the redistribution, not just the transformation in the abstract, and a technology leader who truly understands that their job is not to win every political battle, but to keep moving the organization towards that business outcome. Combination is rarer than it should be. And when you find it, that's when transformation actually happens, my friend.
Got it. This was pretty clear. Now, Theo, when you look ahead, how do you see the role of a CTO or technology leader evolving? Because there's a lot of, fuss, confusions, anxiety amongst a lot of CTOs I kind of talk to. especially in a world where AI platforms and business strategy are becoming inseparable?
Yeah, I think we're really at one of those rare inflection points where a role that has existed in a relatively stable form for multiple decades is being fundamentally redefined, not incrementally, but structurally. And the technology leaders who recognize that are going to have an extraordinary amount of influence over the next decade. The ones who don't are going to find themselves increasingly peripheral to the decisions that matter most. Specifically, here's the shift I see happening. The CTO or CIO of the future is not primarily a technology leader. They're a business leader who happens to have deep technology fluency. That distinction may sound subtle, but it's actually enormous. For most of the history of enterprise technology leadership, the implicit contract was this: the business sets the strategy, the technology team enables it. That contract is breaking down now because in an AI native world, you cannot separate the technology decisions from the business strategy decisions. The choice of what data you collect, how you govern your AI systems, what you automate, and what you keep human, those are not implementation details, Rishi. They are strategic choices that determine how a company competes. And that means the technology leader has to be in the room where the strategy gets made, not just invited in to explain what's technically feasible after the strategy is already set. The other shift is the best technology leaders are going to need to operate with genuine business fluency across the full investment lifecycle, not just inside their organizations, but in partnership with their boards, with their investors, with regulators. I currently work with VC and PE firms now on technology due diligence and value creation planning. And what I see constantly and consistently is that technologies leaders who create the most value are the ones who can connect a technical architecture decision to a capitalization table conversation. Who can explain model risk to a board in a language that lands?
Yes.
Who understand that governance is not a constraint on innovation? It's what makes innovation sustainable and defensible at scale. Finally, this is about accountability in a way the industry has not fully reckoned with yet. As AI becomes core to how enterprises operate, not a feature, not a pilot, but the actual engine of decisions and products and customer experiences, the technology leader becomes accountable for outcomes that used to be considered safely outside their domain. Algorithmic bias, model failure in high stake contexts, data privacy at the system level. The technology leaders who embrace that kind of accountability, who build governance into their architecture from day one, rather than treating it as a retrofit, are the ones who will be trusted with the most consequential decisions. And trust, ultimately, is the currency that determines how much influence a technology leader has in an organization. So when I think about what roles look like 5 or 10 years from now, I see something that looks much more like a chief value officer than a traditional CTO. Someone who's fluent in technology, fluent in business, fluent in governance, and fluent in the human dimensions of organizational change. Someone who can move between a conversation about model architecture and a conversation about talent development and a conversation about board level risk and bring genuine insight to all three. That person is not defined by what technology they know. They're really defined by what outcomes they can be trusted to deliver. And I guess I'll close with something I believe quite deeply because it connects to why I made the transition I made from scaling large transformation businesses to working as a fractional advisor and doing due diligence for investors. The view from outside of an organization is genuinely different from the view inside it. The technology leaders who will have the most impact going forward are the ones who find ways to cultivate that outside perspective because the patterns that predict what's coming in your industry are almost always visible somewhere else at first. And the leaders who see those patterns early and act on them with the right combination of strategic clarity and organizational courage, those are the leaders who will define what technology in the enterprise looks like on the other side of this AI inflection point. That's the role I'm currently excited to play. And honestly, it's now the most interesting work I've ever done.
So the last question is that it's a rapid fire one, like one question, very rapid fire. In your entire experience, which was the best experience, like scaling Cognizant, Accenture, or what you're doing right now?
Well, certainly I'm having a great time right now. And one of the things I've learned about being human is you don't learn as much from a success as you do from a massive failure. And I've been brought into a few massive failures in my day that really taught me a lot. I think back to the early days of the iPhone. It's going back many years, obviously. I had a client, one of the leading telecom providers, who decided they were going to build an iPhone killer. And we won that project. And decisions were made early on about silicon chipsets that were going to hamper the actual technology and the user experience. And while we weren't responsible for the silicon decision, we were still responsible for the user experience. And in the end, the product never shipped. It changed its code name multiple times. The client brought in multiple leaders to try and salvage it. And I ended up being brought in as part of the team to help them understand that the decisions that were made early on were really what hampered the failure of the program after spending tens of millions of dollars. That was a tough pill for a client to swallow, and it was a tough pill for the executive leadership of the company I was a part of to have to deliver and explain why they had spent so much money with us on a program that will never ship.
Thank you so much, Theo, for sharing all these insights in such a structured fashion. Hope, this session is going to be extremely beneficial for all the technology leaders and business leaders who will be watching this, and one of the best podcasts so far.
It's been a pleasure, Rishi. I really enjoyed this opportunity and hope we can connect again soon.
Absolutely, Theo. I will be in touch.
All right. Sounds good, my friend. Have a great evening, day. Take care.